Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's event hosted by the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative. I'm Will Wexler. I direct the Council's Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East programs. As a reminder, this event is being recorded, streamed live, and is on the record. Please use the hashtag ACIraq when posting on social media about this event. Today, we are releasing a really timely new report by our non-resident senior fellow, Dr. Tony Pfaff, on the future of U.S.-Iraq relations. We're at a moment where so much is at stake and a strategic dialogue is expected to take place this summer. If you haven't read the report that Tony has written, please visit the Atlantic Council website where you'll find it. Our team will also be sharing the link to the report in the chat box. We are delighted to have Louisa Lovelock of the Washington Post joining us from London today to moderate this discussion. She'll start off by interviewing the report author, and then bringing in the other panelists into the conversation before we take some questions from the audience. If you do have questions, please submit them by typing into the Q&A box on your screen or by emailing them to Stephanie Hauser Ali. Her email was provided in the registration link that you received. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. Let me begin, though, by just briefly introducing you to the moderator and the speakers. Our moderator, again, is Louisa Lovelock. She is the Washington Post Baghdad bureau chief, as I mentioned, and she joined the Post in 2016 as a Lawrence Stern Fellow and later covered the war in Syria from her base in Beirut. Before that, she was the Daily Telegraph's Cairo correspondent, reporting on the 2013 military coup and crackdown that followed. She graduated from the University of Cambridge with a degree in social and political sciences. Our main speaker today, the author of the report, again, is Dr. Tony Pfaff. He is, as I mentioned, a non-resident senior fellow with us. He is also the research professor for the military profession and ethic at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. He is a retired Army colonel and foreign area officer for the Middle East and North Africa. And he served in this administration, at the beginning of the Trump administration, as a director for Iraq on the National Security Council staff. His last active duty posting before that was senior Army and military advisor to the State Department, where he served on the policy planning staff. Prior to his State Department position, he served as a defense attaché in Baghdad. He served as the chief of international military affairs for the U.S. Army Central Command and as the defense attaché also in Kuwait. He served twice in Operation Iraqi Freedom, once as a deputy J2 for a joint special operations task force and as a senior military advisor for the civilian police assistance training team. He has also served on the faculty of West Point as an assistant professor of philosophy. Kirsten Fontenrose is director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, where she leads the security pillar within the Middle East programs. Kirsten has 20 years of experience in working with the national security apparatuses of nations in the Middle East and Africa from positions within the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of State, the White House, private industry, and the nonprofit sector. She last served in government as senior director for Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council in the Trump administration, where she led the development of U.S. policy towards nations of the GCC, Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Dr. Abbas Khadim, who will also join our discussion, leads our Iraq initiative. Most recently, he was a senior foreign policy fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and he was also formerly an assistant professor of the National Security Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Over to you now, Louisa. Thank you very much for everyone taking the time for this event.
Hey, well, thank you, William. Also to obviously Tony, Abbas, and Kirsten for having me. Obviously, we're here today at a really critical time for the US-Iraqi relationship. And I think, while it's been long trouble, this is probably a time that's full of more contradictions since at the start, since it has been at any time since the invasion in 2003. As of April 2020, Iraq's government is facing what are really an unprecedented array of challenges when it comes to their breadth and also to the potential impact. There's political paralysis, there's COVID-19, there's the potentially disastrous impact of the global drop in oil prices, there's a protest movement, and also, as we're here to talk about today, there is the ongoing duel between between the US and Iran on Iraqi soil. I think a lot of this is addressed in the report, but if we're going to get started, I think the the really important question to start off with here is, how would you, Tony, how would you characterize the relationship between the US and Iraq at this moment?
Oh, thanks for that question. As I note in the report, I think there is, at the same time, a sense of fatigue regarding what we can actually, what the potential of that relationship actually is, that has contributed to the perception, if not the reality, of U.S. disengagement, certainly by the Iraqis. But that fatigue, wherever it comes from, has not impacted the necessity of the relationship for both parties, or even crushed the hope for something better. Last July, in fact, there was a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on Iraq relations, where Senator Chris Murphy invoked, a continued U.S. obligation to rebuild Iraq because of the 2003 invasion. My concern, though, is that after 17 years of trying, that sense of obligation is probably wearing a little thin, especially when those efforts have sometimes been opposed by Iran and some of its allies. So while there's a lot of inertia on the U.S. part to do a whole lot more, there's still, I think, sufficient momentum to prevent full disengagement. And that comes, A, from a desire to make good on the past investment, but it also comes from a series of mutual interests, to include security and related to the fight against ISIS and whatever groups are associated or follow ISIS, such that Iraq and U.S. security concerns are always going to be entwined. Moreover, not just the United States or Iraq, but the region benefits with Iraq being a stable, productive member of the international and regional community. And that's very much in the United States' interest to set Iraq back on that path. So that alone, I think, is going to continue to make whatever you feel or whatever frustrations arise from the relationship, make it continued necessary. So the question will never, ever really go away.
I mean, one of the big points that you make in the report is that the US does have maybe the potential to be a, quote, better partner than Iran. Certainly talking to people in Iraq, talking to people in Baghdad and further afield, the US relationship these days is not one that is seen particularly favorably often. And it's often seen as a country that maybe has a far smaller impact on the national politics of Iran. So, what do you mean by this in terms of, a better, more fruitful relationship?
Yeah, no, another great question. And I think Doug Ollivant, in a piece he wrote a while back, kind of said it best, or at least most succinctly. He noted that the US is good for Iraq, but Iran is good for Iraqis. And so essentially what you can do is look at the two approaches that the United States and Iraq and Iran have embarked on in trying to realize their objectives. Iran advances objectives through exploiting corruption and exacerbating sectarian tensions. That's in their benefit for Iraq to remain compliant but weak. And to that effort, they engage individual Iraqis who benefit from that engagement, but to perpetuate and exacerbate those conditions that are preventing Iraq's recovery. The United States, on the other hand, has spent a lot of money engaged in institution building, which Iraq desperately needs, but works against those entrenched interests that Iran exploits. So it's certainly so kind of in effect, they end up canceling each other out, or probably more to the point, because we can't address directly the Iranian ability to exert that kind of influence. It kind of feels like that what we're doing isn't making any progress. But were we able to set conditions for that institution building and other assistance that we give to put Iraq on a path to recovery, then United States is going to be better for Iraq as a partner than Iran. And if you can just look at the numbers in terms of what the United States has already given, it's considerable. We had, just in 2018, which is the last year that we have numbers for all agency assistance, it was $1.2 billion. Back in 2016, in the height of the ISIS conflict, it was $4.6 billion. So I don't think whatever assistance Iran is giving to put Iraq on a path to recovery compares to that.
So, of course, you mentioned Iran. One of the things that you do argue is that the US needs to stop putting Iraq sort of slap bang in the middle of that rivalry and that tension. And I think while this is obviously something that we hear a lot, the ways to do that might be harder. You have Iran-backed militias repeatedly and indeed often striking military bases where US-led coalition soldiers are. They're not just killing coalition soldiers; they're killing Iraqis as well. How do you suggest that we do take Iraq off the stage? And also, if the impetus is therefore on domestic sovereign actors, how could they be convinced to do something which in many ways might be seen as being quite against their interests?
Well, so I think there's a couple ways that there's a couple of things to unpack in that question. One is the security relationship. And so that security relationship is going to require an enduring U.S. presence, not a permanent. There's a difference, but we still play an important role in capacity building, as well as filling gaps in Iraqi security force capability necessary for their fight against ISIS. But we do need to take care to ensure that that focus is on developing that capability to fight terrorists and insurgents like ISIS. And doesn't become the kind of thing that Iran would see as a threat. Why? Because Iran and Iraq fought a very long war. They're still very sensitive about that. And no one does anyone any good by igniting those kinds of tensions again, or giving Iraq or Iran any reason to fear each other. So whatever our policies are, they need to keep that in mind as a limit. And that should shape how we posture ourselves militarily. Further, asking Iraq rather to take political action against Iran is also going to be very difficult unless it's clearly in the Iraqi interest. And what that doesn't mean, though, is that we don't enable Iraqi leaders and organizations to push back on the more malign aspects of Iranian influence, which, as I noted before, really are a major cause for what's driving the protests and Iraq's continued inability to recover.
So I think broadening out the discussion a bit, we've had quite a big year already in terms of the relationship with the US. It started with the strike, the Trump administration strike on Qasem Soleimani, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandis's convoy, and just bringing Abbas and Kirsten into the conversation. I mean, how has that strike that at the time seemed so seminal? How has that affected Iraq and Iraq's politics, this big US decision, Abbas?
Mute here. Okay, thank you. The impact was tremendous. On the most important part of it is that it dragged Iraq into at least from an Iraqi government perspective, it dragged Iraq into a conflict that is not necessarily Iraq's conflict. This happened in the context of US-Iran escalation, and the fact that there was the United States has chosen to do the strike on Iraqi soil is something that disturbed the effort of the Iraqis for a long time to keep a neutral position in all of the conflicts that are regional or international. The Iraqi government, from the government or administration of Prime Minister Haider Abadi, then the current Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, made it a declared policy that they would not enter into the foreign policy of Axis. So they would not really join any party in a conflict, and they kept their neutrality. They sensed and declared that they had enough problems of Iraq that they needed to handle, and they were not interested in taking part in any side conflicts, whether it's Saudi Iranian, American Iranian, all of the other conflicts. And of course, it is not just that strike, but there was a cascade of other events that happened, and most dangerously also the Iranian strike on an Iraqi base that hosted American troops and led to a multiple injuries among the people in the base, mostly coalition members. So it was the Iraqis' reaction was a unanimous rejection of any act like that, and they considered it a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. And not just one, but it was two violations of Iraqi sovereignty. The American strike was seen by the Iraqi government as a violation of their sovereignty, but also the Iranian strike, also another violation. It was the first time since decades, in fact, that the Iranians had any military action or a strike against an Iraqi territory. Those ballistic missiles were a dangerous escalation. So the Iraqis were not satisfied by the fact that two of its main allies, in fact, its most important two allies, were turning from allies that were helping with the fight against ISIS, with combating terrorism, into allies that were bombing Iraqi territories. And of course, the Iraqi government had no choice but to leave the niceties of alliances out and then start to appear that they were acting as a sovereign state by taking many measures, including not just condemning the acts, but also going to the United Nations and complaining against both the United States and Iran. And of course, that is not just as an Iraqi government initiative, it's because the pressure from the people of Iraq was tremendous. Iraq has all 360 degrees of views with the US, against the US, with Iran, against Iran, with the Iraqi government, against the Iraqi government. It's a very hard and delicate situation to keep balance of, even without incidents like that. But the impact was of very, very major or large proportions. And the Iraqi government was not looking forward to that, especially it came in the middle of a lot of chaos in Iraq. That is Iraqi problem. The protests that were going on from October to January at the time, and also Iraq was having a government that has resigned and was facing all kinds of challenges. So it could not have come in a worse situation, timing, not that there is any good timing for a military conflict.
So, Kirsten, the strike at the beginning of the year obviously set off a pretty intense spiral of brinksmanship between the US and Iran on Iraqi soil. You had ballistic missiles, you had more strikes. How would you describe the kind of administration thinking right now in April? You know, things seem to have calmed down. You've got COVID, you've got other things on the agenda, certainly for the Trump administration. I mean, how do you see their thinking? Where are they at when they look at Iraq, and kind of how to proceed on that front?
First, just let me point out that in the administration's thinking and a lot of the U.S. government, you know, the strike against Soleimani was not intended to be analyzed in the context of just Iraq. It was part of a much broader campaign, a much broader strategy that I won't go into. I think most people are familiar with the authorities that were used to conduct it and the reasons that was conducted. That really, despite the perhaps detrimental impact on some of the immediate situations in Iraq, was part of a bigger picture, and we can get into that if you're curious. But to your specific question, Louisa, the U.S. is looking now toward these talks that are scheduled for June, and really whether or not the strategic dialogue actually takes place is less important than the fact that it is on the schedule, that we are looking toward that, because what we're hoping for is that both sides will show some restraint between now and June, and we can kind of pull back from this brink of war that we're teetering on at the moment. There are specific requests that I think the U.S. administration should make in that strategic dialogue. I think there are things that Iraq should ask for, and up until June, we should be nugging out the details of those. And the administration right now is willing to kind of put the conflict stance on hold. But what we are seeing is a debate within the U.S. government between the hawks and those who would like to be a bit more constrained about whether or not this policy will work. The hawks are saying, look, we don't trust that the Iranians are going to restrain their proxies until June. And we're really kind of sitting on that pin, because if there is additional activity, if there is additional proxy activity or Iranian aggression against the US, what we're watching in the Arabian Sea, for instance, then we very well could see a much larger retribution from the US side than we've seen on December 29th or post-Soleimani, in March. We'll be looking at something much bigger. And what we're hoping is that Iran is reading those signals and recognizes that we're no longer in a tit-for-tat situation, that the stakes are much higher now.
I'm curious to know, do you think that there will be troops, US troops in Iraq, say, a year from now? That's been the big sort of media debate here.
I think there will be. I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I think what we will have there is a really quiet contingent. If there's anything left of OIR, if we're seeing, we're talking about looking at an ISIS resurgent region wide. Look at Egypt, look at what we're seeing in Syria. And I think if we see that also in Iraq, then we'll definitely have some special guys kind of quietly operating with their Iraqi partners on the ground, making sure that ISIS doesn't have a chance to take a territorial foothold. And then I think that the training mission will remain to a certain extent. We're looking to pass a lot of it off to NATO. NATO will leave if the US leaves. So I think we will work on a conversation with Europe and perhaps with other partners to remain in place for training missions. We have a phenomenal relationship with the counterterrorism forces, and it's really important that we continue to support Iraqi conventional forces and build them up so that the PMF don't become the sole providers of security in the country. So I think, I would be turning to Jordan and Egypt and Tunisia and some of the recipients of more of our security assistance and saying, hey, we've trained you all. It's no longer safe for our troops to be there. Iraq has made it clear we may not be welcome, but for NATO to stay, we need to leave some sort of presence. Why don't we come up with a partnership arrangement where some of the folks we've trained from your countries can potentially replace American trainers, but we'll still stay in the mix, perhaps more in the background.
Tony, you talk in the report not just about sort of competition with Iran, but also about things that the US can do sort of unilaterally, maybe competitive advantages it has. You touch on economic issues, and I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about what you think might be a way forward there.
Yeah. So I think, as we talked about a little earlier, there's a sort of a simultaneous sense of fatigue, but also an imperative to continue. So what we first need to do is kind of scope our goals to what the relationship can actually sustain. And I think those goals include fighting ISIS, as we talked about, enabling Iraq to contest the worst kind, the kind of malign Iranian influence that perpetuates the conditions that impede its recovery. And then also find ways to promote economic opportunity and diversity. And all three are both in the US and Iraq interest. Doing that is going to require, this is going to require a lot of patience. This is not a short-term kind of thing. During the ways and means to achieve those goals to what just the US can sustainably provide, but also what the Iraqis can absorb. We've already kind of talked a little bit in Kirsten's and Abbas's response about what that would look like. I agree with Kirsten. I think the training mission and efforts to build capacity are going to continue. I also agree that it's a good idea, if it's not already in process, of diversifying who provides that kind of capability. But it does suggest also that we need to be able to operate with Iraqi forces, particularly in times of a crisis. So a lot of the emphasis on that should be on interoperability. Because more effective reform of Iraqi security forces is just going to be a long time coming. We've already talked a little bit about contesting malign Iranian influence, and that it's about playing to our comparative advantage, which I discussed. But I'd also argue that an important part that's missing is constructing a joint positive narrative between the Iraqi government and the United States government regarding what the relationship actually consists in. Like I said, the United States has provided a great deal of aid, but the Iraqis don't see that. It's filtered through the United Nations, which then puts an Iraqi government label on it. And there's good reasons for doing that. But it would be very helpful if the Iraqis government would acknowledge that, so that gets to be part of what of the face of what the United States is doing for it. And then finally, with the economics, there's a lot of things that are impeding things that can help. Most notably is when it comes to, so there's a lot of economic reform that needs to happen, and that's going to be a long time coming. But when it comes to foreign investment, where the government of Iraq is the major contractor, often contracts with major U.S. companies are end up being opposed by Iran. So that kind of capability to get into. At the same time, there's a lot of regulations and difficulties with visas and other conditions, to include security, that prevents private sector investment in Iraq, which would also be, I think, important to overall improving the relationship. But ultimately, the kind of strategy or the approach that I think that we can embark on, because all these things we've been trying, they're very hard to accomplish. But what we need is to identify, I guess, goals that we can achieve, ways and means to achieve them, look for the opportunities to move the ball down the court a little bit further. An example of that would be the protest, back participating by against the protesters. And that would have been a good time to remind the Prime Minister of his announcement to get them to get.
I think you're frozen, but I have a couple of other questions before we open it up. Abbas, we're having this discussion as Iraq's political factions are sort of jockeying over the future of a new Prime Minister designate. It's the third Prime Minister designate in 2 months now, 2.5 months, not long at all. If he's successful, I wonder how you think his success will be perceived in Washington. And also, this is someone who's often spoken of as a potential, someone who's not outwardly hostile to the US. What do you think he can achieve, and what sort of agendas are going to be affecting his ability to do so?
Okay. So these are several good questions in one question. One of them is, will he be confirmed? Of course, he had better chances at this beginning than his two predecessors. He was at least the selection or the choice of the various parties came out of a consensus, especially the Shia political blocs who presented his name to the president. So they, and normally the selection of the prime minister is the affair of the Shia blocs first, and then the other sides, they might exercise their veto if they think that this person would not be friendly to them or to their interest. So he had a good chance to begin with, but of course, always it boils down to each bloc having what they want. So there are lots of demands and very few things that he could offer. I mean, you can only hand out so many ministries and so many positions, and you can only make so many promises to people, especially when the demands are mutually exclusive, which is the case. So he came in as a candidate with a lot of consensus behind him, but in the negotiation process to form a government, that process began to face hindrances and problems. And now, until now, he is held. He was forced to change his cabinet list several times, and then his program has been not going as smoothly as it could be. So these are the problems. It is over the negotiations of the spoils that each bloc wants to have a share of. If he is confirmed, and that is, it has to be seen by next week, then there are other limits on him. It has nothing to do with his personality or his capabilities. He is going to inherit an Iraq that is out of money. Prices of oil are in the negative, and also Iraq that is shut down, like almost all other countries around the globe because of the coronavirus. and very little tools in his kit that he can use to handle the challenges that are mounting for the last 17 years, but also the new challenges that happened in the past couple of months. And also there is a latent protest that could erupt anytime. So if Corona that is shutting the country goes away, then it will immediately be replaced by demonstrators who will shut the country. Also, they will take shape immediately. And let's remember that the protesters are not on his side. But internationally, he is viewed as someone who is liked by both the United States and the Iranians. I wouldn't say like him, but they tolerate him. And also, he has a lot of respect among the regional players because he was leading the Iraqi national intelligence, and that allowed him to cooperate with almost every other intelligence agency in the region and beyond. And he has not made any enemies because he was not in an executive position that would anger the Iraqis. So there are positive and negative things. I think the biggest challenge is that there will be challenges that are not of his own doing, and unfortunately, he is not in a position to make much about.
Well, thank you. We have some good questions coming in. I would say please forgive any names I read wrong or words that I apparently can't read in English, but I will do my best. We have a question for Kirsten from Robert Danin. Kirsten, there was a debate within the US over Iraq, you say, and you've mentioned that there was a hawkish view within that. What was the other view? He's saying it's not clear what the debate is and what exactly it was over.
Sure. The other view boils down to this. It's avoid kinetics, give the new prime minister time to form a new cabinet, because a U.S. strike on Iraq, on the PMFs in Iraq, even if directed by Iran, would ignite additional Iraqi popular opposition to the U.S. You know, if you're looking at a situation with one big effort and one small effort, a David and Goliath situation, nobody empathizes with Goliath. So even if the U.S. was provoked, a U.S. retaliatory strike would inspire Iraqi public opinion to kind of turn against the U.S. presence. So this non-hawkish view within the U.S. government says, hold back, move our folks into hardened locations, hunker down, let's push for the strategic dialogue. And then at that point, let's renegotiate our relationship with Iraq. Let's not use kinetics in the near term that could throw this off. The danger there is that Iran knows this very well. And you could have either the proxies or Iran-directed action intentionally derail these talks or intentionally derail government formation by provoking the U.S. So that view kind of relies on Iran being on board as well.
We have one from Randall Rahim for Dr. Abbas. Hadn't Iraq already relinquished its sovereignty by not stopping militias from acting unilaterally outside of control and interest of the state? So statements of condemnation are insufficient to uphold sovereignty. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't believe that, of course, my greetings to my friend Ambassador Randall Rahim. The Iraqi government has not surrendered its sovereignty. It was taken away from them by the fact that, first of all, the Iraqi government has not inherited a strong state or a strong security force, and that has, we could go back all the way from 2003 or 2004 when the Iraqi security forces were put together again. So a lot of what needed to happen to put together a credible and strong security force for Iraq did not happen. Training, equipment, all of other things, including the doctrine, etc. The other problem with the loss of Iraqi sovereignty is that, as I mentioned in my earlier statement that the two major allies of Iraq, the United States and Iran, both of them acted unilaterally against the Iraqi government will and without consultation with the Iraqi government to violate the Iraqi sovereignty. And, these are the two countries that should be most interested in keeping a sovereign, strong Iraq, but they did not. Both of them acted according to their own interests, but with complete disregard to the interest or consent of the Iraqis. And what would the Iraqi government do at the time? It is not in a position to fight its own allies, and it is also not capable of doing so. Then, on top of that, of course, the question of the militias. It goes back to the original problem that created those militias. Had we had good, credible, strong Iraqi security force that did not collapse or would not collapse when ISIS invaded Mosul in June of 2014, we would not have that fatwa that led to the popular mobilization, ended up automatically creating militias. Of course, this is another problem that Iraq has to deal with. And again, I think the problem with the militias that it's not just that they have weapons, but they have also political votes in the Iraqi parliament. All of them have political wings and also military wings. So the Iraqi government really found itself in this hard situation that always undermined its sovereignty, because there are so many fronts, so many parties that are violating Iraqi sovereignty, and the government is not in a position to fight on all these fronts and to fight all of these parties, either because it is incapable or because they are allies, and the Iraqi government has a bigger fight to tend to, which is the fight against terrorism, that everybody is supposed to pull together to really unite and fight the ISIS and other terrorist activities.
Thank you for that.
Louisa, can I jump in here really quickly?
Yeah, please.
To Abbas's point, that this back and forth with the Iraqi government is what puts the international community in a tough position. Because if they say on the one hand that the PMFs are under their direction, so a strike against them is a strike against Iraqi sovereignty, but on the other hand say, but we can't control them, and their strikes on the US are not violations of Iraqi sovereignty, then all we can do is say, well, then it is your responsibility to control them. And if you do not control them, if you say they are enough under your control that they are not, that our strikes against them violate your sovereignty and their strikes against us do not, because they are part of your state, then we have to hold them responsible for controlling them. And when we do that, then we run into, it unlocks international law authorities that allow the US to conduct strikes against the PMFs if the host government is unwilling or unable to protect partner forces that are there as guests. And it creates questions back here about things like conditioning Iraqi security assistance. If these people are under your control, then why is the US providing payments to train and equip a partner force that is repeatedly attacking our own troops? So we need the Iraqi government to kind of pick one argument or the other. And unfortunately, both have repercussions for the relationship.
Certainly in terms of the discussions we have with people in Iraq, for all the discussions about how the US might ask the Iraqis to take a lead and deal with the militias themselves, people often don't want to do that. It's often not worth their livelihoods to do that. And Tony, I wonder how you feel that the US could go about addressing that contradiction. On the one hand, the Iraqis will say publicly that this is what they're going to do. They're a sovereign nation. They will take all steps to address the militia threat. But as it comes down to it, it is a very difficult thing for them to do, given how deeply embedded these groups are. These Iraqi groups are in Iraqi state institutions.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point to remember. What we are calling these Iraqi militias the Iran-backed militias are part of the Iraqi security forces, technically. So I try to make it clear in the report. I don't see, other Iraqi security forces from the other ministries taking them on directly anytime soon. I don't see any charge of the nights like you saw in 2008. But I do think we need to be perhaps a little bit more proactive and creative in making the Iraqi security forces part of the solution. And there's a lot of ways, I think, to do that. One is to continue with the capacity building, because that makes the necessity of the militias at times of crisis diminished. So, and that will constrain some of the room that they have to maneuver and make claims on resources. But we also can, I think, put, as I think Kirsten was saying, put a lot more pressure on the Iraqi government and ministries to put pressure when the militias engage in behavior that is just clearly not in the Iraqi government's interest, which includes attacking U.S. forces on bases where other Iraqi security forces reside, or attacking U.S. forces in general. I think we do a lot more to do that. I think they could put that kind of pressure on them, and I think that would have, and I think I would like to see more of that before recommending anything perhaps more dramatic. But they've done it in the past. I think they can do that in the future, and I do think they have the ability, if incentivized and backed up, to at least constrain the kind of activities and malignant actions that these militias engage in.
We have an anonymous attendee asking about the role of Sistani, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani. What role do you perceive the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani playing in the coming months with respect to Iraq's political stability? Can the Grand Ayatollah be a positive influence in line with what he's done in the past? If so, what is his role specifically? If not, why not? Abbas, if you want to take that first.
Yes, the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, not only he can be positive in the coming months, he has always been the one positive voice and player that everybody sort of agreed on his description as a positive player. On the one hand, Grand Ayatollah Sistani has been in several challenges were faced by him and others around him. He has no constitutional power or formal power, legal power to do anything unless basically it's an advice that the government and everybody else involved would take. And that is the nature of the Iraqi religious authority, unlike Iran, where its role is constitutional and in the constitution written as the final arbiter in Iranian politics. So that's a constraint. But on the other hand, he has great influence among the people, and sometimes he's put in a position to act even if he doesn't want to. On government formation and the politics, they kept a distance this time, and they said that they will not even be speaking to anyone about that. But on the issues of the security situation, they are involved. Recently, there was a major development happened to the situation with the fighting groups, the militias. The most important brigades that were loyal to the Marja'iyya, the Sistani network, have gone to the Prime Minister and asked to be detached from the Popular Mobilization Committee. And it was okayed by Grand Ayatollah Sistani and his network. And that was a very important message that was sent to everyone who is trying to be unruly and to act in a way that is not in coordination with the government, that they could easily be isolated by themselves. Because one of the good things that are happening good here is, an interesting word, is that, if you are one of those militias that are very loyal to Iran, you are happy that you are under a big mantle, a large umbrella that is the popular mobilization units that are receiving their legitimacy from Grand Ayatollah Sistani's blessing. But if there is this sorting out of the various groups, and then those loyal to Sistani that are the source of almost all the legitimacy of the popular mobilization units get to be separated on the side, and now they are attached to the prime minister and the commander-in-chief directly, then those guys will be clearly in the open and they will be without any legitimacy whatsoever. And of course, right now, the order that Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi signed is still unclear. He kind of took back some of its force by saying that it is not a complete detachment. But in fact, it was a very strong message from Grand Ayatollah Sistani to everyone that he doesn't want to be part of this dangerous activity that is happening outside the state, outside the law. And he is not interested in granting them legitimacy or a blank check anymore. So that's very important, I think. And I think we will expect more from Grand Ayatollah Sistani in the coming months, especially after the formation of the government. And of course, they will have a saying on the US-Iraqi negotiations that are scheduled for June.
We have a question from Matthew Zais. Can't we start holding Iraq responsible for continuing to fund elements of the PMF which are designated terrorist groups and led by designated terrorists? Kataib Hezbollah, Asayib al-Haq, he says, all get dollars from the government of Iraq. Tony, what do you think about that?
First, hi, Matt. It's a great question. Matt and I were together on the National Security Council doing Iraq stuff. So I think so. He's quite the expert in his own right. But I would just say this is, at this point, probably a good example of the kinds of things we should probably be thinking about in order to exert that kind of pressure on the Iraqi government to start just seeing to its own interest. You have to be careful about how you do it without undermining other efforts and other relationships, but giving them the backing they need to restrict the money that these groups are getting from the Iraqi budget is a way of applying pressure that I think we should explore. However, none of that. It's not clear that will work without doing other things outside of just simply imposing sanctions or getting the Iraqi government to restrict the budget. We have to work to create the political space for the Iraqi government to be able to do that. And that goes back to my point about the narrative. As long as and I saw some of the other questions here, as long as those militias are able to portray themselves as benefactors to the Iraqi people, and that's not challenged, that political space is going to be diminished. Somebody pointed out earlier, they've got a lot of backing. Their fate is tied very much to the political parties in the parliament that back them. We need to make it difficult for them to do that. And I think the protests provide an opportunity to do that as well. So that was a good question. Thanks, Matt.
And Louisa, I'd add that one thing I think the U.S. government should consider, and I know has been discussed, but there have not been final decisions on, is conditioning security assistance. To the point that if the Iraqi government says that the PMFs are under their control, why is the U.S. funding their training? One thing we could do is condition security assistance. So, aside from the provision of assistance to the CTS and to OIR specific units, what else can we do? The metrics we could look at, let's say we do condition security assistance and we say, Iraq, you're only going to receive training equipment for these specific units. And until we see tangible impact of a policy to rein in these rogue PMF units. The kinds of metrics we'd be looking for would be directing the PMFs to refrain from violence. I mean, it's as simple as that. Do we see them conduct additional attacks on the U.S., international, and Iraqi forces on bases or not? That's a really simple one. A second one might be, let's see the Iraqi government repurpose the PMFs toward more civic action programs. As someone has mentioned in the questions we've seen, there is action right now by a lot of the PMFs it's an influence operation, frankly, to portray themselves as provider of services to the people by working on sanitization programs against COVID. This is wonderful that they're doing it, regardless of what their reasons are. But why don't we repurpose all of them, if we are the Iraqi government, toward this effort, since it is the crisis of the day? This would make them look better in the eyes of the public. But if we put it under a banner of the government of Iraq, these are uniformed members of the Iraqi military, and the government of Iraq is directing them. We want that thanks to go to the government of Iraq and not to the PMFs specifically. We could also redirect them to things in infrastructure rebuilding, like a civic corps, in addition to medical response, agricultural response. The World Bank and USAID have stressed in recent publications that the agricultural sector is in dire need of support and rebuilding. So, the US government and other governments do this all the time, use our military forces for what we call med caps and vet caps around the world to assist populations outside of big cities. No reason you couldn't see the PMFs repurposed for something very pro-social like this, as an indication that the Iraqi government truly was in control and was monopolizing use of force.
If I may say something about that, Kirsten brings up a very important point, which is, using U.S. leverage on the Iraqi government. But there is one little important note to be made here, could be even a footnote. This would be the thing to do if the problem is that the Iraqi government doesn't want to rein in these militias or rechannel them or dismantle them or put them in a structure that would make them safer than they are right now. Then we say we pressure the Iraqi government and it will do it. Our problem is that the government actually wants nothing more than putting these militias under its control. It can't. So any squeezing of the Iraqi government, any weakening of the Iraqi government by withdrawing some of U.S. support to the Iraqi government will play into the hands of the militias. In fact, this is exactly what they want. What bothers them most is any improved relations between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government. So the more we cut of our help to the Iraqi government, the more pressure we put them, the more deterioration in the U.S.-Iraqi government relations, the better these guys feel they are. And that is, a very important factor. No matter how much pressure we apply on the Iraqi government just reached its limit of what it can do with these militias, because first the government needs them. They are still holding important positions on the security. They are strong and they get they are voted into office. Their political wings, and they have a saying in the parliament. So any government decision they are part of, and they are important part of, and they have guns on the streets, and also nobody in the Iraqi security forces is interested in carrying up weapons and going against these militias. So, here you can apply U.S. pressure, but only that you see the Iraqi government will say, there is not much we can do so bad that you are not happy or satisfied with what we do. But we've done everything we can, and it will take time for us to get anything done. And take time in the Iraqi government parlance, it means kicking the can down the road.
And Abbas, to your point, one of the things that we need to you think about is, why is it only U.S. pressure? Where's the international community in that discussion?
Right.
If the Iraqi government is going to throw up its hands and say, we just can't do anything, then they're going to be placed in a position where all of the international community is going to pull out in terms of its training and equipping. And then they're left with what options? China will not come in. Russia happily will. And then they become Syria. So, is that what they're looking for? They'll need to make some decisions.
Right.
We have a question from Charlie Burnett Ray, who says, what changes might we see to the US-Iraq relationship if Joe Biden is in the White House come 2021? Tony, what do you think? He is either frozen or very still.
I'll be honest, I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that question. Am I on? I don't know, but ultimately it kind of goes back to what Abbas and Kirsten have been saying. what I was saying earlier, the room to maneuver with the relationship in Iraq is already pretty limited. As an issue with the ball down the road, doing some of the things that we previously talked about, and you might be able to change some behaviors, but you're not going to fully resolve the problem. What I think, but if I were to characterize at least what I've heard from friends who've been working in the campaign, that you're going to see a continued interest in engaging Iraq, probably, but again, it'll still be over the same kinds of things. We'll want a security presence to help combat to fight ISIS. You'll see continued interest in helping conduct institution building, but probably not a lot more in terms of resources towards that. What I hope they would do is, as I recommended earlier, is to start looking for opportunities to engage, to expand the kind of engagement that's going to put Iraq on the path of recovery. But beyond that, I don't have any particular real insights on what the Biden campaign will do.
From the Iraqi view, basically, there's a mixed feeling here. On the one hand, Joe Biden is associated in the Iraqi mind with his old plan when he was a senator to look at Iraq as the three entities with a degree of autonomy. Iraqis, in fact, call it dividing Iraq. He was not calling for that, but that autonomy among three Iraqi sides. So he is not really kind of looked at favorably. But also Iraqis remember that he was the vice president during the Obama administration. And Iraqis had a comfortable view of a return to the Obama administration days if the Obama administration's project in the region and especially in Iraq is picked again. So if we see a return to the Iran nuclear deal or something like it, if we see a less U.S.-Iranian conflict, that will also translate positively on the Iraqi side, because this is almost all of what the problems we talk about here would go away if the U.S.-Iranian conflict is figured out in a way away from Iraq. So that's another important part, and I think that is where you will see more positive relations. It's all boiling down to what would an election of a President Biden mean for U.S.-Iranian conflict. And then Iraq will be, the positives on Iraqi scene will be byproducts of that. But clearly, U.S.-Iraqi relations themselves, it's not much of a difference. You could perfectly have a good relation between Iraq and the U.S. under either Biden or Trump. Either president would, on the merit of the relations, I think it's the same. But it's how the U.S.-Iranian relations will be different, and that will dictate how the U.S.-Iraqi relations will be different at that time.
I would agree. I think, the Iranian objective to push the U.S. out of the region predates this administration. It predates administration before that. So I don't think we'll see a change in that objective, but what we could see is a change in the tactics they use with regard to their influence in Iraq. So we could see Iran encourage the PMFs that are under their influence to sit quietly for a bit and see what they'll get out of the U.S. administration. I don't think we'll see any reduction in their work to co-opt Iraqi politicians or in their work to negotiate for U.S. drawdown of overt military capability positioned in Iraq. It could mean that things get a little bit quieter on the kinetic front, but it won't change the actual kind of strategic conflict, maybe without arms, between the U.S. and Iran that takes place in Iraq.
I think we have time for one last question. Where has it gone? So Todd Cyril. ISIS threat is growing again and spreading to other areas of the world. I think partly. Can the international anti-ISIS coalition survive and continue to effectively counter ISIS if the US and thus the coalition presence dries up in Iraq. I think for context, the ISIS militants in Iraq have been pretty small scale in their attacks in recent months, pretty much since they were territorially defeated a couple of years ago. But they have seemed to be a little bit more assertive, particularly since the COVID restrictions were put in place. They have recently hit an intelligence facility in the city of Kirkuk, wounding 3 people. How do we see the threat in Iraq right now, and how do we think the US can counter them, continue to counter them if they were to not be there? Abbas.
Well, clearly ISIS activities have been significantly curbed, and now we don't see anything more than what you usually expect from a group that is defeated but struggling to make a presence once in a while, remind us that they still exist. I think the Iraqi government has gained a lot of advantage in the war against ISIS. They already know what their capabilities are. The Iraqi forces, all forces, I'm talking here, not just the Iraqi army, but, and this is one of the, again, facts, whether people like it or not, it is, the Iraqi forces are many entities with mixed loyalties, but all of them have united against ISIS. This is not one of the issues that there is a dispute. Everybody fights ISIS and fights ISIS strongly and with great conviction. And the Iraqis gave a lot of sacrifices to defeat this terrorist group. So now we have more capabilities, I think. And if ISIS were to try to make another showdown, I think they will not be allowed to make any significant gains as they did in 2014 or beyond. So the Iraqis are comfortable the way things are right now, that they are in control. They can never be having an airtight security, but they are not as vulnerable as they were in 2014 or 2015. The coalition needs to stick to its guns and needs to make sure that it does not become a victim of these political disputes between the US and Iran, between the US and Iraqi government, or within the Iraqi groups among the Iraqi political blocs, because this is not a fight to be politicized. Terrorism is a threat to all, and when terrorism gains territory, there are no winners. That's why I think, and speaking to Iraqi leaders all the time, they realize that, they get it, and they are acting with this kind of understanding that they do not want to allow their political disputes to spill over into a situation that might give advantage to ISIS. But I think it's more than just that ISIS is defeated, is that Iraq and Iraqi security forces have gained significant experience and significant capabilities, and now they know how to protect the country much better. And with the allies being there with them, I think there are many guarantees. And what the Iraqis need from the coalition, they don't need really boots on the ground. What they need is a credible air coverage, political backing, a lot of other things that were done during the fight against ISIS. Let's remember that the defeat of ISIS was done by Iraqi hands on the ground. All of the casualties almost were Iraqis, and it was what the invaluable help that Iraq got from the coalition was the air coverage, and also was the political and moral side of it, where Iraq was feeling that the entire world, led by the United States and a few other great Western powers, that they were behind Iraq, and Iraq was not fighting alone. This needs to continue.
And Louisa, one thing for the Iraqi government to think about also is that if this should happen, if the US were to pull back as ISIS is potentially resurging, then the reason they would end OIR or pull out entirely would only be because the Iraqi government and the parliament would elect to evict them after government formation. So if that's the case and ISIS does choose Iraq as its next theater, then the Iraqi parliament, it's on their shoulders what happens to Iraq, because they will have asked the US fighting force to leave. And, you know, in the immortal, beautiful, timeless poetry of LL Cool J's Mama Said Knock You Out, don't call it a comeback. I've been here for years. So, you know, ISIS is waiting for this opportunity. And frankly, if they want to give a gift to the US-Iran relationship, then they could choose Iraq as their next kind of re-debut theater. Because, you know, let's all imagine a world where, because there is this resurgence, we saw previously that US air power was on the same tarmac as helicopters bringing in Qasem Soleimani. You know, there have been times when the two countries have kind of operated without speaking, but with room for the other, because there was a combined objective. So, you know, if ISIS really wants the US-Iran relationship to become one where there is potentially technical cooperation, then go ahead and come back on in.
So I think we are out of time. Tony, do you have any final thoughts?
No, well, thanks for that. No, other than to thank everybody for attending. And as I'm looking at the questions, I think they're excellent. So I think we are out of time, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, well, thank you. I'm sorry to everyone whose questions didn't get answered. Thank you to the panel, this was great. The report is online. The report is on the Atlantic Council's website under the Iraq Initiative. I believe there's a link with the event invitation to this today. If anyone can't find it, shoot me a message. I will send you a link. And yeah, I think we need to wrap up and say thanks for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.